I've been trying to run the setup of Doxy for the past few minutes in my machine, but it seems like I have some errors, but I'm going to show you to walk you through the installation. It's an easy process to follow along. So I'm going to show you the installation process from the article that I had written earlier, and that article should be able to guide you on how to install it without encountering any challenges. So I'll have to stop this for the moment and share the article itself. So this is the article that, just a minute. So this, from this point here, installing up Doxy, setting up Doxy into our machine. So the first step you need is for you to initialize using the npm command. So this is the command that initializes Doxy in your project. So by running this command, this is the output that you'll be expected to see in the terminal in this case. So as I said earlier, when writing a documentation, it is always a good idea to include graphics and code snippets. So as you can see, that is exactly what I'm following along in my documentation or in my article here. So we have this, the first step, initialize Doxy using this command, and after that, we need to install the Doxy package into our machine. And the command of installing the Doxy package into our project is this one here, npm install save Doxy. In this case, here might be the other name. It's not a must for it to be Doxy. It might be any other name that you're comfortable with, but the last part should be included. As you can also go ahead with the article itself and the commands since they are provided there. And this is the output that is expected for you when installing the Doxy package in your project. Now, after installing the Doxy package in your project, you may have to install React or React DOM as well. After that, be sure to add the 3 scripts in this file. So after installing the package and initializing Doxy in your project, be sure to add these 3 scripts we have here in your package.json file, which will be located in your source file. It will be in your source file directory named package.json. You can also go ahead and, you can go ahead and copy this if it won't be automatically installed in your machine. So as I mentioned earlier, Doxy uses Mdx format and allows you to easily integrate JSX inside your Markdown. So to initialize that, you need to run either of these 2 commands depending on the operating system you're in. So for me, since I was using Windows, this is the one that I had to run in my machine. And the third step is for you to create a Mdx file. The Mdx file is the one that will be used to, the file that will be responsible for you writing your documentation. It will have everything that the user will be able to read from the documentation guide that will be provided online. So go ahead and create a file and give it an extension of .mdx. And in the file, the format is this one. You'll have to begin with this format in order for the file to reflect in the documentation itself in the browser. So be sure to follow this format here. And after creating the Mdx file, after writing everything you need regarding your documentation, be sure to save it and run this command again. The command will initialize and open a port that has your project documentation in it. Initially or generally, the project should open in port 3000, and if you follow along the code snippets given in the article, this is the expected output that we should have by the end of you running the commands that are given in the article. As I mentioned earlier, it's always a good idea to give expected output. So if you don't have this output by the end of running all the mentions command up here, be sure to check exactly if you followed them in the correct manner, so that to be sure you have everything set and running. So as I mentioned again, it's in the Mdx file that will be able to write our documentation, and it's going to display to us what will be visible to us. So for example, as you can see here, Hello there, creating an awesome documentation using Doxy. The same thing is the one that is generated in the window after running the Doxy setup. So be sure to follow along, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out via the article in the comment section, and I will be willing to assist you. Again, I apologize for not showing you the live code. My machine ran into some problems while trying to do the same, so I really apologize on that. So hopefully you'll be able to do that exactly and have a fully running setup of Doxy in your project. And if you may encounter any problem, again, feel free to reach out. So let's move forward and see the don'ts that you might, actually not you might, the don'ts that you should avoid when writing a documentation for your project. The don'ts to avoid when writing a documentation for your project. Well, the first thing, don't promise anything. So when writing a project documentation, it's always a good idea not to promise the users anything in the future. When creating it's advised not to promise future features. At the moment, if you are not sure of anything, don't promise it. Only include the features that already exist in the product, or the ones that will be completed before the documentation is officially published. Don't promise anything if it's not working. But if you are able to add features and test on them and be sure that they are fully working, then you can go ahead and add them in the documentation and update it in your official documentation of your product. But whenever releasing a documentation for a ready product, don't promise any future product. Take, for example, let's say like the earliest product, the latest product that was launched, which was, I believe, which was iPhone. We never knew anything about the iPhone, for example. Only they were able to share the information when they were sure that everything that they were working on was fully functional and was 100% guaranteed for the user to enjoy. So the same thing happens when you are trying to create a documentation. Don't promise anything unless you are sure that it's fully working, you have tested on it. Then you will be able to go ahead and add it in your documentation and relaunch it or update it online. As I said earlier, one of the things that you should consider when writing a documentation is always make sure that it's up to date. So whenever you add a new feature to your software or your product, be sure to go back to the documentation and update it so that it is reliable to the person, to the new user who is trying to use it. Another point is, do not duplicate. If you have described several similar algorithms, design, APIs, etc., do not duplicate all of this over again. Have it described in one place and use reference in the other section. As I mentioned earlier, when trying to write a documentation, do not repeat yourself. Make sure that if it's a must for you to repeat a code, it's better for you to use a reference. Be sure to write that specific part of a code in one place, and if it's a must for you, even if there is a need for you to repeat it, use a reference. For example, like to see the setup of Doxy code, something of that sort, use the reference on figure this and this, or use the reference that is provided, or use the reference that will link a person to where the exact code is. Don't repeat yourself, don't duplicate code, don't duplicate APIs, don't duplicate images, don't do that. And again, the last option is unsupported features. Documenting on unsupported features should be excluded. Nobody is interested in the testing units you had to conduct before launching your product. But if it is necessary, be sure to explain the support status and give more details about the same. So whenever we develop softwares, whenever we try to come up with new programs, we always have that testing period. And whenever we try to write a documentation, I'm pretty much sure you as the user won't be interested in knowing that the product failed these and these times, the product was not able to perform this and this. So be sure to exclude that part from your documentation and only include the relevant information that the reader will be willing to. Be sure to include relevant information that will be relevant to the user who is trying to use your product. Don't include unsupported features in your documentation. I'm pretty much sure the reader would be, most of the users who will be using your documentation might not have the knowledge that you have of programming or something of that sort. So you including the unsupported features that you might have encountered along the way to the documentation might really look bad to the person trying to use the documentation, because first, they will not understand what exactly is happening. They will not understand what the code exactly does, and you including that may even demoralize them from using your documentation along the process. So be sure to avoid these 3 main points. Don't duplicate anything. Don't promise any future updates if you're not sure of them, and don't include unsupported features like testing in your documentation. So on the poll, we had which is better alternative to ViewPress for curating front-end documentation. So we have 50% of you went with Doxy, and 50%, actually 50%, 100% of you went with Doxy. So Doxy it is. What are the 2 main types of documentation? That, it was, I think, in the second, third part of the presentation slide. So we had product documentation and process documentation. So those are the 2 main types of documentation we covered in the section today. True or false? Before you begin writing your documentation, it is highly advised you define your target audience. That's very true. You cannot begin writing your documentation if you do not know whom you're trying to target with the product you're trying to launch. So be sure to check on the target audience before writing the documentation. If you want to write great documentation, the first step is for you to be sure you understand how the product works. Exactly. If you want to write a documentation for a certain product, be sure that you have used the product, you understand exactly what the product does, how it functions, so that you'll be able to explain it to a person who have never come across the product, and whenever it will be easier for them to use the product following your explanation via the documentation. So that's true. If you want to write a great documentation, the first step is for you to understand how the product works. Provide diagrams or other graphic materials to help understand and communicate the structure and design principles. Also, that is very true. Whenever you're trying to write a documentation, it is highly recommended that you use graphics, material, and pictures or code snippets, so that the person trying to follow along might know what is expected from them if a certain thing does not run as expected. So following this from the article, you also saw that we tried to follow along the do's for writing a documentation. We were able to provide code snippets. We are able to provide graphics of what is expected after running the code snippets. So by providing graphics material, that will be a good idea when writing a documentation. So be sure to follow these and every other thing that we have covered today to make sure that you write a good documentation that will be good practice for your users to read and follow along. Thank you.